Great. Cool. Do I need to... Okay, great. Am I up on the stage, Amanda? Is that where I should be? Stage? Or could I go down here? Is it better to be down here? I'm going to be down here. Just because it feels a little awkward for me to be up there. Thanks. It's good to be with you all this morning. My name is Matt Llewellyn-Otten, and I am the Associate Director for Religious Organizing at Outfront, Minnesota. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about LGBTQ identities and our faith communities and ways that we can think about the LGBTQ community, the ways that we can think about queerness, think about welcoming people more openly, but also think about it in a theological way, a way that we can begin to dive into some queer theology. So it's really good to be with all of you this morning. A little bit about Outfront, Minnesota. If we could go to the next slide. I have to read this because this is a new mission and vision statement, so I don't have it memorized yet. So this is our brand new mission and vision statement. So Outfront, Minnesota's mission is to build power within Minnesota's 2S LGBTQIA+ communities and address inequities through intersectional organizing, advocacy, education, and direct support services. And we envision a safe and equitable world where all members of our communities are free to lead lives of opportunity, autonomy, and full self-expression. Beautiful, wonderful words, but what does this actually mean? Right. So first, we have 3 main departments in Outfront, Minnesota. So first, we have policy and organizing, which is the department that I am in. And in policy and organizing, we have a lobbying arm. We can talk to our senators, our representatives, the governor, and we build relationships with these people to talk about LGBTQ people in the state of Minnesota. We also organize people, like congregations, to think a little bit more about how they welcome and affirm queer people, but also how they can show up for queer people in the community at really pivotal moments. Our second department is education equity, and so educational equity works with school boards, they work with administrators, they work with teachers, and they work with students to think about the ways that LGBTQ kids are welcomed within schools. We, of course, have seen a lot of school board drama on the news, and we are actively going to these places and speaking to people and putting out what really what matters to the queer community in these spaces. Third, our direct support services, we have an anti-violence program. And so the anti-violence program works directly with clients. People can call 800-800-0350 if they're experiencing any type of violence within their life. Or maybe they're left without resources and they need to be connected to resources. We can do that. We have a social worker that works with us. We can get direct services to people that are in need. So beautiful vision and mission and vision statement, but those are kind of the ways that we see Outfront working towards that mission and vision statement. So we have a cute agenda that I've prepared. Just throw it out the window, okay? So I'm going to give you you're going to be drinking from a fire hydrant for a little while, but please feel free to interrupt me. I may have a microphone, but we're all within speaking distance to one another right now, which is fantastic. So if you have a question or a comment, feel free to raise your hand and stop me. If I'm speaking too fast or if I'm not speaking clearly enough, please stop me. So one of the things that I would like to emphasize is sometimes stories might be shared, but so we want to be able to share stories with one another, but we want to leave those stories here. So we want to be able to trust one another in this space. We want to use I statements when we're talking about things. We want to say I feel uncomfortable, or I feel uncomfortable pronouns, or I don't get pronouns, or maybe we want, what's the example I put here? Oh, I feel confused about pronouns versus nobody gets pronouns, they're too hard, right? We want to frame it in a way that we're speaking from our own personal experiences. There may be some more questions that you have. Much like our faith, we kind of wrestle with non-closure, right? We're kind of always in this journey of what does my faith mean? We're also maybe have some thoughts that come up during this conversation, and you may not have closure about them. Try to be comfortable with that. Sit with that for a little while and see how that ruminates with you. Question and answer. I will leave some space, but it's always that awkward moment after you finish a big presentation. And it's like, any questions? And nobody has questions. So please interrupt me if you have a question. Or save your question to the very end. Next slide. A little bit about me. I'm a former youth minister. I was in youth ministry for 13 years. I give off youth minister vibes. I know it. It's who I am. It's what I did. I'm a Minnesota transplant, but I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm a graduate of Boston University School of Theology. I got my MDiv from there. I also have a Master's of Public Administration, and I majored in Bible and religion in undergrad. So my life has always centered on this idea of the Spirit leading in some way. Ministry has always been really important to me, and I see the work that I do now as another form of Christian ministry. I love coffee, I love candy, and I am a firm believer in the Oxford comma. Yes, we need that comma. It is so important. And my favorite quote right now that I see every day when I sit at my desk: fish live in streams, birds nest in trees, human beings dwell in warm hearts. It reminds us that the Spirit is with us. Let's skip down 2 slides. It's not that I don't care who you are, it's just that I got a lot to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about terms and definitions, things that you may be familiar with, and some things you may not be. A lot of the question that I get is, what's the 2S that's in front of the LGBTQ? We're going to get into that. So before we dive into that, we have this beautiful image of this person holding up different aspects of gender and sexuality on the next slide. Here we go. Yes. So we have this wonderful depiction of where things might live in the body, where different aspects of gender and orientation might live within the body. So first we have gender identity happening there within the brain. A person's own sense of if and in what way they're man, woman, a mix of them, or maybe somewhere in between, or maybe outside of those boundaries altogether. We have gender identity living in the brain. And then in the little hand of the person, we have gender expression, kind of symbolized by a haircut. And this is a person's behavior, mannerism, interest, or appearance to communicate their gender in a cultural context. What's really important is that cultural context aspect. Gender expression always happens within a cultural context. Then we have this over here in their left hand, sex and gender assigned at birth. Sex is a medical context, and in a medical context refers to a set of physical characteristics affected by our body's combinations of hormones and chromosomes. In other contexts, it often leads to assumptions about who you are. We'll get into sex and gender assigned at birth a little bit, but keep that expression, sex assigned at birth, in your brain. Orientation and attraction describes how people generally find themselves sexually or romantically attracted to other people based on the expressed gender of those people. And we see that happening within the heart of our little person. I think it's important that we first get these definitions out of the way, because when we're talking about LGBTQ plus communities, when we're talking about 2S LGBTQ plus communities, people get orientation and identity mixed up a little bit. So when I go through these next terms, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So the 2S stands for two-spirit. And this is a person who is born with both masculine and feminine spirit. And it should only be used by indigenous people to Turtle Island, North America. It's not to be taken out of a very specific cultural context. There's a great book called Land of 10,000 Loves, and it's a history of queer Minnesota. And in this book, they give accounts that are through the perspective of French colonizers of somebody named Ozawindib around Leech Lake. And it's important to note that two-spirited people were venerated within these communities. They were a part of communities, often caretakers of children. This idea of a masculine and feminine spirit being within a person is to be honored. L, a woman who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to other women. Women and non-binary people may use this term to describe themselves. We'll get into non-binary a little bit later. G, a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender. Men, women, and non-binary people may use this term to describe themselves. So sometimes I get the question of whatever happened to gay, right? What happened to gay? It's still there, and it's often used as a umbrella term. People will use this to describe themselves often. All genders, all sexualities, people will use this term. Bisexuality, an individual who is emotionally, physical, or sexually attracted to multiple sexes or genders. And then we're getting into orientation, or we're getting into identity, gender identity, when we talk about trans people, a term for people whose gender identity differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Queer, this is often used as an umbrella term. I recognize that this word queer also comes with a lot of baggage, that it has been used to hurt people in history. It has been used pejoratively for a really long time. And I also like to remind people that there's a whole generation of young people who don't know this term as being hurtful. They see it as empowering. They see it as a term that helps not to pigeonhole them into finding one identity right away, but that they can begin to explore their identities and figure out who they are. Which leads into questioning, a term used to describe people who are in the process of exploring their gender identity or their orientation. Intersex. Intersex people are born with a variety of differences in their sex traits and reproductive anatomy, including differences in genitalia, chromosomes, gonads, internal sex organs, hormone production, hormone response, and their secondary sex traits. So the word that you may hear in biology books or kind of old time is hermaphrodite or hermaphroditic. We use the term intersex when we're talking about people now. When we're talking about animals or, I don't know, like germs or little things, microscopic beings, you might hear the term hermaphroditic, but we use the term intersex to describe people. We have a slide on that, and we'll get into that. Asexual and aromantic. Asexuality exists on a spectrum. The way that people feel sexually attracted to another person can exist on a spectrum. There may be conditions around the way that they feel some kind of way about another person, sexually attracted to them. And the same for romanticism. It happens on a spectrum. There may be levels, differing levels of romantic attraction to people, or they may not be, they may not have romantic attraction. And then finally, the plus. It's to signify this ever-growing community of people. And maybe even terms that I didn't talk about already. We have pansexuality, we have demisexuality, we have all of these other identities. So I like to use the plus because there's an ever-growing list of people, and we like to be able to signify that. Yes, please. Oh my gosh, what a great question. Thank you so much. Hold on to that question, because I have a whole slide dedicated to it. We'll skip the next slide and then go to the next one. Perfect. So this idea of sex assigned at birth, this is a term that I told you to kind of keep in your brain. So we want to use this term, sex assigned at birth, when we're talking, especially about people who are trans. Because we want to say their sex assigned at birth is male, and they are female. We don't want to say they used to be this, they used to be, now they're this. We want to say sex assigned at birth, because when my brother came out of the womb, they said, "It's a boy." They held him up, and it's because he had a penis, right? That's what they said. And my brother grew up all of his life saying that his gender is boy. We want to extrapolate a little bit between sex and gender. Sex is more biological. It's based almost always upon the appearance of our physical anatomy. We find out often people may not, we'll talk about it in intersex. I'm jumping ahead of myself. But then, I was born, and they said, "It's a boy," right? And I grew up a lot of my childhood thinking, okay, boys do this, boys do that, and always kind of questioning that. And then as I grew up and I was in youth ministry and kids began to come out as non-binary, I was like, oh my gosh, what is this? What does this mean? And I kind of had to do a deep dive into my own gender identity. And I use he and they pronouns. You can switch it around. That's okay. Have fun with it. That's the point. I know I have fun with my own gender identity and who I am. And so switch it around. And so I consider myself to be non-binary because I don't like this idea of kind of being in one thing, one gender. And it doesn't fit for myself. And so this idea of sex assigned at birth is really something that does shape gender within our world and shapes gender identity. And we want to be able to use this phrase instead of somebody used to be something and now they're this, because they were always that person. They were always the person that they're telling you they are. So we want to honor people in that way. Next slide. This idea of intersex, I talked about it a little bit. There's some key terms here: ambiguous genitalia, genetics and chromosomes that we want to keep in mind. But I think what's more powerful, I don't know if that video is going to show up. Is it going to? Good job, Amanda. It'd be great if we could get that video playing if it does. I always think it's more powerful to hear the voices of intersex people than to hear me talk about it. If it doesn't play, that's okay. That's okay. No worries. I've watched it enough times to get the meat of it. Often we see that intersex people have correctional surgeries as infants. They're born with what might be considered to be ambiguous genitalia. I was in a church not too long ago, and there's a congregation member who's talking about their history within the medical field. And as a nurse in the nursery, I guess, I don't know, she saw many times that it was easier to turn somebody into a girl who might have been born with ambiguous genitalia. We see this practice kind of coming around in the 1950s, and now we're seeing a movement of people opting not to force a child into some type of surgery correctional surgery if it's not medically necessary. The way that the nurse put it, that like plumbing was working, right? Everything was working, but there was such a pressure for somebody to assign a sex right away that they didn't allow the child to fully express themselves. So there's this great video that I'll send to Amanda to be sent around to you all about the experience of intersex people. So this next activity here, it's just a tool that we use to get us thinking a little bit about gender and identity. So I'm just gonna propose a couple questions to you all, and I want you to just think about it a little bit, and then we can debrief a little bit. So, first question, how do you know what gender you are? Can you describe your gender? When did you first become aware of your gender? How have your family and friends responded to your gender expression? What do you really like about your gender? And finally, what would you change about your gender or other people's perception of your gender? So take a moment, think about those, and then we'll do a debrief. I need water. Okay, I gave you a moment. If we can go to the next slide, I have some debriefing questions. So, which question was the easiest to answer and why? I'd love to hear from all of you. The easiest was what would you change about your gender or other people's perception of your gender? Could you say why? Do you mind saying why? Okay.
I have always identified as female. It was a gender assigned to me at birth, and I've always felt like a woman, like expressions of femininity, and I like that. And I really like being strong, and I really like being able to move stuff and kind of that independence. And I've received messages as I've grown up, like, that's not ladylike, or you're never going to be attractive to someone if you keep. So, like, the back and forth of what is acceptable femininity and like attractive femininity, and that being a part of me being female versus like I get to be a capable individual person and how I live into that. And so that, I mean, just that femininity is weak and passive and secondary and mostly rooted in how I'm seen by other people is, anyway, that's the stuff I
Yeah. And the idea of like your femininity has to be performative in order to attract a mate, a suitable mate. Right? Yes. The performativity of femininity in our culture, especially for people assigned female at birth, is huge. Yeah. Which question was the hardest to answer and why?
the whole time I thought a lot about when did I first become aware of my gender.
Mm.
I actually spent the whole time really like only on that one, which is interesting. And I think the answer for right now is just that, like, I have a mom and a dad, and so it's like, well, I know I'm a
Mm.
girl, so do like what my mom is doing, and my brother do what like my dad is doing, and at least that's at least for me, like the beginning is.
Yeah, so that idea question, which question is that?
The third.
The third question. How do you first become aware of your family? You see gender roles being played out in your family unit. Yeah, yeah. I think that's the first time I've heard somebody say that in this, but I don't think you're alone in that experience. I think we learn gender roles when maybe we have two parents of different genders and we see it played out. Of like, my mommy's doing this and my daddy's doing this, and so, yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah, please.
I guess number one is actually hard for me.
Yeah.
Only because I know I've been raised as female. I've had children. I have the female anatomy. But yet when I look in the mirror, and I've told this to my husband, I look like, my face can look like very masculine.
Mm.
I do masculine things like working with wood and, the masculine types of jobs that people associate men with versus women. And so I say I'm a woman, but
Mm-hmm.
there are masculine identities with it.
Yeah, yeah. Saying, you have identified as a woman for all of your life is kind of what you're reflecting, and then, but there's parts of you that aren't always what I like. The gender that society expects us, the performative type of parts of it. Yeah, but appearance. Yeah.
I have a more masculine facial shape than, to me, anyway.
I think you have a lovely face.
Thank you.
Your husband does too.
In the mirror, that's what I see.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, in appearance, in this is how you see yourself. Yeah, thank you for that reflection. I appreciate that. Anything come up for anybody? Anything else come up? Has anybody ever asked themselves these questions before? Yeah. I'm seeing some yeses. I'm seeing some nos. I'm seeing some, I don't know, maybe. This next slide, we're going to go into what is gender identity and how does it play out. So like I said before, it's this internal sense of oneself. Remember, gender identity is through that pictograph, that infographic of the brain. It's the way that we think about our gender. And it's often influenced by our sex assigned at birth. So we have two terms here: cisgender, a term whose people identity doesn't differ from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So I like to point to my husband. My husband is cisgender. So he assigned male at birth, has always been male, has always identified as a male, even though he can walk in high heels really well. And then transgender, a term for people whose gender identity differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth, right? That key term, sex assigned at birth. We see that coming up here again. So cisgender is not a bad word as much as Elon Musk wants to make it so. I don't know if you heard, but he was trying to ban the word cisgender or cis off of Twitter or whatever it's called now, X. So it's not a bad term. It's a term that is used for people. Cisgender. It's just a word in our culture. Cis or cisgender. It's not pejorative. You're not being accused of anything when somebody says you're cis, right? And then we have this term non-binary. And it's a term for people who may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between, as falling completely outside of these categories, while also many people may identify as transgender. Some people do not. So we have this beautiful depiction here of the umbrellas. I love this metaphor of these trans umbrellas happening here. First, we have the trans umbrella, and we have kind of a binary transness happening. So binary code, ones and zeros. My husband is a software developer, so he knows about that stuff. When he talks about binary, I'm like, oh, you mean gender? And he's like, no, like actual like work. I'm like, oh, okay, that's my work, and okay, whatever. I talk about feelings, you talk about science. So trans men, trans women, right? Somebody who might be assigned female at birth and is a male, is a man. And somebody who is assigned male at birth and, wait, am I saying that right? Assigned female at birth, but is a man, and somebody who is assigned male at birth and is a woman. So we have this kind of binary happening on both sides of the umbrella handle. I like to point that out, that there's this binary between the two. And then we have non-binary, kind of still, I like to point out that to be trans, there's not a checklist. If only life were that simple, right? Somebody can't be too trans or not trans enough, or can't, like, you know, maybe you haven't done this, so you're not trans, right? Or maybe you've done this, so you are trans, and it doesn't work like that. And non-binary people are often saying that these kind of social constructs of gender may not fit with who they are as a human being. Thank you. And so we have these identities under here: gender fluid, non-binary, bigender, gender flux, two-spirit, agender, androgyny, trans femme, trans masc. So we have all these terms under here, right? But I encourage you to Google them. I'm not going to get into all of them. But the important thing to note about all of this is that somebody can't be too trans or not trans enough. It's just a part of who they are as a human being. We can go to the next slide. Beautiful. Gender expression. Like I said, gender is socially constructed, right? What is acceptable in one society and what classifies, there's a better term, somebody as being male or female changes within culture. The expectations of femininity performance, right, or masculine performance changes from society to society. So the way that gender is expressed also is culturally significant. The way in which a person acts to communicate their gender within a given culture. And while gender expression can communicate gender identity, and oftentimes there are themes, keep in mind that there's no one way to look a certain gender identity. That's why like pronouns become really important, and I can touch on that a little bit. So why does this all matter? We have some great statistics here from the Trevor Project in this bar graph. So this is association of gender-affirming spaces with past year suicide attempts amongst transgender and non-binary people. What we see here is that the more supportive spaces that a trans and non-binary young person has, the less likely they are to attempt suicide or to even die by suicide. So, no affirming spaces in a person's life, 28%. One affirming space, 25. Two affirming spaces jumps down to 19, and then 15%, 3 to 4 affirming spaces. What does an affirming space mean? It means a place where they feel free to express who they are as a human being, to say, my name is so-and-so, maybe different from the name that you know them as. Or they're able to dress in a certain way. They're able to express their gender in a way that you may not have expected, but then you say, you're welcome here. So what do these spaces look like? Homes, neighborhoods, schools, after-school programs, churches, These are those spaces that can be places of real support and affirmation for young people. So when somebody goes through the process of gender affirmation, you may notice changes, right? So these changes might be social, they might be in appearance. Oh, can we go back one? I'm sorry. I wasn't done preaching from the last slide. There we go. So this can include social, medical, or legal components. But the important thing to recognize here is that transitioning can greatly improve a person's mental health and general well-being. One of the things that I like to emphasize when we're talking about gender affirmation, and then you can go to the next one, I'm sorry, thank you, is that we have this idea of higher rates of suicidality among people who are queer, who are trans, who are non-binary. But one of the things that the rhetoric that we often hear is that it's because it comes with being queer. It just is a part of it. And I like to say that it's not because I'm queer that there's higher rates of suicidality for my community, but it's because the pressure that society puts on queer kids to perform a certain way, to be a certain way. I was bullied relentlessly in middle school and high school, and that takes a toll on somebody, even as like a 36-year-old adult. There's certain points in my life where I'm like, oh, I remember that first time that somebody threw me against the wall and called me a faggot, right? Like, I can remember that. And that's visceral. Like, when I hear that word and somebody use it in a way, I can remember how I felt as like a scrawny little 8th grader being spat in the face with this word. So I can't remember how I got there, but when we're talking about the way that society often rejects anything that's what's expected and what's normal, that's what causes these suicidality rates to increase. And also, when gender identity is debated on like the House and Senate floors or like from a podium in a church, there's actually statistics that show that like helplines light up more even when things are being debated on House and Senate floors. Like, kids are listening. This is in the news. The kids are calling in, and then they're seeking the support that they need. There's these two terms, gender incongruence and gender dysphoria. This is often a medical term used for people who are trans, who, you might need that kind of medical condition to begin a transitioning process. And the transitioning process is not one that is taken unseriously by medical professionals. It is taken very seriously. It's taken often with parents in mind, with the kids in mind. It's not easy. People think that, getting hormones and getting prescribed hormones or doing these gender affirming surgeries is easy. Doctors have care that they have set up in order to care for the patient in an ethical way that requires a lot of hoops for somebody to jump through in order to get the care that they need and want. And so these are terms that are used when kind of in that transitioning process. Gender incongruence is the word that we use more now than gender dysphoria. And so it's classified as this clinically significant distress caused when a person's assigned birth gender is not the same as the one with which they identify. While this is a common experience for trans people, not all transberry people experience dysphoric feelings. And so it's not to be confused with body dysmorphia of, our bodies look different than how they actually appear. That's totally different. to us, our bodies look different than how they actually appear. That's totally different. Gender incongruence is something else. So let's get into a little bit about how's everybody doing? Am I moving too quickly? I have about 20 more minutes probably, right, Amanda? Is that right? Okay. How can we contribute to creating affirming spaces for people? So this is just kind of my my little part of the presentation where I get to talk about like fun things about creating affirming spaces, and then we get into a little bit about theology, which is my jam. So first, when we're talking about what is an affirming space, we can go to the next slide. So allyship, it's this state of state or condition of being an ally, supportive association with another person or group. And the important thing to recognize about allyship is that you can't just show up somewhere and be like, I'm an ally, right? It's not self-defined. It's something that comes from the work that you do, the relationships that you build with people within a community with which you want to ally. There's this great term here, there's this great definition here of allyship. Allyship is not self-defined. Our work and our efforts must be recognized by the people we seek to ally ourselves with. I would never end a sentence with, but okay. So when we're talking about allyship, what are key postures? We want to be non-judgmental. We want to be open. We want to use reflective language that other people are using person-centered care. We want to meet them where they are. And then we want to educate ourselves. It requires us to do some research on our own, but also allyship always happens in relationship with people. All of the stuff that I'm talking about, identity, orientation, I think the most important part is that it's about relationship with other people. And we use these terms, of course, and the terms might be overwhelming in our brains, but the important thing to recognize is that terms help us define community. And so when we're kind of when we want to say we're in allyship with somebody, we want to use the terms that people are using. We want to reflect that language well. We'll go to the next one about affirming spaces. So I like to use the term affirming space because I think the term safe space is so overused, and we need to recognize that not all spaces are safe for everybody. There's class, there's gender, there's race. All of these things kind of come into play whenever we're talking about a safe space, right? No space is entirely safe for everybody. In one of my colleges, they had these stickers on the door, and at the time it was cute. It was like the first time I've seen it. It was like, this is a safe space. But like, who's going to be able to access that academic safe space, right? So we want to create the term, I like to use the term affirming spaces because it implies that we're doing work, that we are a part of the work, that we're trying to learn more, we're trying to be in good relationship with people. So when we're creating these affirming spaces, we want to imply this intersectional lens when we're talking about people. And when we talk about intersectionality and we don't mention Dr. Karen Crenshaw, I like to say an angel cries. So intersectionality is a term created by Karen Crenshaw, especially for education and the ways that many levels of oppression can affect a person. So a Black female student, right, who might be, her parents might not make a lot of money, right? So there's multiple levels of oppression happening. We have race, we have class, we have gender happening. And so when we look at a person and when we want to affirm them, we have to recognize all of the things that they are, right? Their orientation, their education, where they come from, who their parents are. Like, these are all a part of who a person is. And so when we want to create affirming spaces, we want to recognize those spaces. And how do we get to know them? We build friendships, we build relationships, we are in community with them. And finally, a part of affirming spaces, we all are part of the work. It doesn't just take one person, it takes a whole community to create an affirming space. Next slide. We'll go to the next one. One of the major things that I like to remind people is that when we're talking about creating affirming spaces, we want to avoid assumptions. So, like, we want to avoid this assumption that, like, all people are heterosexual, right? And so that can be reflected in our language. We can say partner instead of boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, right? We might want to say partner instead of that, especially when we're talking about, like, marital status. Boyfriends and girlfriends and partners, no matter if there's, like, legal bound documents, are still significant in a person's life. Someone's sexual orientation based on the gender of their partner or their dating history, we want to avoid assumptions that, like, a person is completely straight just because of who they're married to, or completely or gay, right? There's bisexuality is a thing. It's a thing that we need to recognize. Someone's sexual orientation, gender identity based on their appearance. We want to be in relationship with people, and that's how we get to know them. Someone's orientation or gender identity is the same as the last interaction. What's beautiful is that we live this human experience, and people are able to change their minds. And we have the capacity for changing our minds about things. We have the capacity of learning something new and reshaping our worldview and who we are and how we want to inhabit the world. And so we want to not make assumptions that people are just the same as the last time we saw them, right? Because you're not the same as the last time you saw somebody. 2S LGBTQIA people are engaging in risky or criminal behavior. My life is just as boring as a straight person's. Let me tell you. I'm going to go home. My husband's going to have football on TV. I'm going to read a book and probably take a nap. That's going to be my day. And then I'm going to eat dinner, and it's going to be great. And then tomorrow, I have to go to work. You know, like, my life is really boring, and so is everybody else's. And so we're all trying to get by in this world, and we're all living our best lives as we can. And so we want to avoid the assumption that queer people are living some kind of risky or dangerous life, because I have a mortgage too, and it sucks. This next part is I want to talk a little bit about queer theology, and you may or may not be familiar with queer theology, but I'm going to define it a little bit and break it down for us. So first, I want to say there's this great resource if you ever want to, like, do like a first dive into what is queer theology. What's its base? What is it based on? Where does this come from? This book by Patrick Chang is a great resource. It reads like an annotated bibliography of queer theology. So you get a lot of resources, but the lens that he looks through is that, and I'll get into this later, Jesus is a dissolver of boundaries. So there's this theme of Jesus getting rid of those boundaries that we thought were so permanent. And there's a new way that we can look at the life of Jesus as affirming of queer people. So when we talk about queer theology, it's a contextual theology, which means that it's developed from experiences of queer people and holds a perspective that queerness is a nuance through which we can read the Bible and interpret Scripture. It's a new lens that we can put on. It's an affirming theology. Gender identity, it affirms that gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexual relationships of queer individuals are equally as good and holy in the sight of God as cisgender heterosexual people. Next slide. It's not associated with one denomination. Any church can put this lens on. Anybody can begin to look at the Bible a little bit differently. And this new lens through which we can read Scripture and interpret Scripture, we're able to put this lens on when we're looking at tradition, too, the way that tradition shows up and where we're coming from. I went to a Methodist seminary, and so I know a lot about Methodism. Thank you. I know a lot about it, but I can't say the word. And I know that there's been a lot of drama about the affirmation of queer people within the United Methodist Church, and didn't know that until I got to seminary. Because almost everybody with me was like queer, which was hilarious and weird. This is a way that we can begin to look at our Methodist tradition a little bit differently. We're able to see the ways that maybe it's a little queer, maybe it's a little gay, and we can look at it a little bit differently. So what's the basis for this? So we have this idea of the Imago Dei, and the Imago Dei translates as the image of God. And so we have this coming up often in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 of God looked at creation, said it was good, created people and said it was good. In God's own image, God created them, scriptures say. And when we're talking about the image of God, we see ancient, I guess John Calvin is ancient, right? We see ancient theologians like John Calvin reflecting on it, but also Irenaeus reflecting on it. This is a theology that undergirds a lot of what we talk about, right? We hear about the image of God, the Imago Dei, even when we're in Sunday school, right? This idea of like you are a reflection of God. When I would lead mission trips for Sundays, for youth groups, we would end, service trips, we would end each day kind of like, where did you see God today? That's the image of God, the very face of God. All God's creatures are mirrors of God's glory. Quote from John Calvin. So, when we're talking about the Imago Dei, especially when we're talking about queer theology, this image of God tells us that we are all made good in the image of a loving God. So here we have one of my favorite little cartoonists. You can find him on Instagram and social media, the Naked Pastor. I can't remember his real name, but he's kind of a former evangelical guy who has become, who's an artist. And there's this beautiful picture he has here. Whoa, 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 whoa. We have a crowd of sheep here saying, whoa, 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 hold it right there. He wasn't lost. We kicked him out. And then somebody who we can presume is Jesus, right, carrying another sheep with the trans flag, decorated as a trans flag. I know, and I found them. And what I love about this is that lost sheep, Jesus going after the lost sheep and bringing them back into the fold. But more than that, they're using affirming pronouns for that sheep. They're using them instead of him, right? They use him, yeah. And so when we talk about the image of God and then we begin to think about the image of Christ, there's this great quote here by this theologian, Virginia Mollenkine. The church must let go of an inaccurate and unjust binary gender construct that does not allow room for Christ himself, who is also Christ herself. We are all a part of the body of Christ. In this next slide, Elizabeth Stewart reflects a little bit on this too. Jesus is a male born of no male matter, the Immaculate Conception. As such, Jesus crosses traditional gender boundaries about what it means to be chromosomally male. Pretty cool that we can think about what it actually means for Jesus to be male if we're talking about this theology of the Immaculate Conception. And we can begin to think about these theologies and reading the Bible a little bit differently, right? Maybe not taking them as true for the way that it happened, but it doesn't mean that there's not truth in the way that we read stories. This next one, Jesus as dissolving boundaries of the divine. We have Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. That which we thought was so permanent, God is with us, Emmanuel. Even the coming of Christ through Christ's birth is a dissolving of the boundary of the divine. Society, right? We have Jesus, a Jesus who ate with tax collectors, touched sick people, had lots of female disciples that, just aren't talked about. But lots of people that society tells us who are the lowest of the low. And Jesus said, no, the last shall be first. And then we have this idea of identity. We have the transfiguration. We have this idea of Jesus even being transformed in those moments. That identity maybe isn't as permanent as we once thought. I can't remember who did those. Kate somebody, but they do these beautiful icons of Jesus, and I love reflecting on the way that Jesus can be seen today, especially when we're talking about the immigrant. We have Jesus here with the Holy Family here shown as an immigrant. We can go to the next slide. Sorry. Thanks. Sorry about that. When we're talking about pronouns, we use pronouns all the time, and so this is going to kind of be the last little thing I want to leave you with. We use pronouns all the time. So when we're creating these affirming spaces, it's important to reflect the language that we're talking about, the other people's language, right? And so we also want to use the right language. They help us identify people, and they may help communicate a person's gender. Because of gendered associations, we need to be mindful of the misuse of one's pronouns. So even looking at this these little comic characters, right? You're making assumptions about the way a person looks, even when they don't have facial features, right? We're making a lot of assumptions, and I do too, right? My brain goes to an assumption about somebody. And so when we're kind of in spaces that we need to use a person's pronouns, it's important that we ask. So how do we, sorry, I'll talk about neopronouns for a moment. In English, pronouns are... In English, neopronouns are any pronoun other than she, her, he, him, or they, them. These are new pronouns that people are using. Neopronouns exist to help people feel seen, respected, supported in social spaces. We see like sie and here up there. Sie, them, theirs is often used too. So yeah, it might be some adjustment, right? And people can change their minds. But neopronouns are maybe new pronouns that people might be using that we may not be as familiar with in the English language. We can go to the next slide. So how do we share pronouns? First, share your own pronouns, right? Matt, I use he and they pronouns. takes practice. But we want to be able to share our pronouns. It encourages other people to do the same. Ask and invite. I don't say that you force people to share their pronouns, especially when we're talking about like email signatures. We see a lot in businesses where people are putting their pronouns in an email signature. We don't want to, like, especially in like corporate places, enforce a policy, because that's could be unintentional outing for somebody. And so we want to be sure that we ask people and invite them in to do the same. Utilizing visuals, name tags, little like name tents, lovely right there. Name tags are so helpful, and a place that we can put our pronouns. Build it in when you're incorporating it. Incorporate the invitation to share pronouns and encourage others to include them in their introduction. This can go a really long way in a church community. We want to get comfortable. That takes practice. And then part of the invitation is to teach others, right? We do this as a community. We share our pronouns because we believe the image of God is in all people, and we want to reflect the language that God's people use. We want to use that same language. That's good theology, right? That's creating an affirming place for people. Okay. Gender inclusive language. One of the things that I like to say is, like, when we're talking about ladies and gentlemen at a church, right? We can say God's children, God's people, right? Children of God. We can use non-gendered language when we're talking to an audience. So, when we say, like, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, we want to say, welcome, friends, thanks for joining, hello, beautiful people, right? We want to use different language. Ma'am or sir, just say, hello, good afternoon, can I help you find a seat, right? Can I get you anything? Boys and girls, students, right? Friends, everybody, y'all. I'm from the South. I like to use y'all a lot. Guys, this is part of our lexicon, right? This is a part of Minnesota, is to use you guys. Was that good? That's pretty good. It's a pretty good Minnesota accent. You guys, get that big. We want to say, hey, all, or y'all. You know, we want to use non-gendered language. Mr. or Mrs. Ask how they like to be referred, right? It's okay to ask somebody. We don't want to attribute words to people if they don't resonate with them, or maybe you're misgendering them in that moment. And misgendering happens. It can be intentional or unintentional. It can be by using the wrong term, and there's moments where we can say, "Oops, I'm sorry." And move on. That's the last thing I want to leave you with. Next slide, next slide, next slide. There we go. So we're going to mess up whenever we are trying to incorporate these things into our practices and into our churches. So this is the last thing I'm going to leave you with. When we make a mistake, correct yourself and then move on. When I first met Lily, Aiden, he was on a skateboard. We want to use language. We want to use the language and move on. So, like, let's say I messed up, right? Or you messed up, and you kind of are like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I've really been trying to work on my use of pronouns and names, and I went to this great presentation by Matt from Outfront at my church, and, we've really been practicing this, and, I looked some stuff up online. What happens? It becomes you. It becomes about me and not that other person. So if we can just correct ourselves and move on, best practice. When someone corrects you, say thank you, and correct yourself and then move on, right? She is so good at skateboarding. Thanks. They are so good at skateboarding. When you hear someone make a mistake, get in the practice of interrupting them. It's a gift. to other people who might be trans or non-binary, if other people are advocating for them and saying, they, oh, yes, thank you, right? Reminder that they uses they, them, theirs pronouns. So we want to be able to interrupt it when we see it happen. Next slide. There we go. Thank you so much for your time. Again, I'm from Outfront, Minnesota, and I love doing these. I love being a part of communities in this way. And I want you just to remember that I am a resource. My email address is really easy. My last name's terrible, so you don't need to remember it. Matt@outfront.org. If you have questions or if you need resources, please feel free to email me. And I know Amanda is a great resource for all of you too. And so please be in touch should you need something. I'm here to help in any way possible. So thank you so much for your time. I've gone over by 3 minutes. So thank you so much. I know it's lunchtime.